Good evening, everyone. Why don't we get started? I want to welcome you all to tonight's second event in the Security Conundrum Speaker Series. My name's Amy Ziegert. I'm the co-director of CSAC, the Center for International Security and Cooperation. I'm also a senior fellow and associate director at the Hoover Institution. The Security Conundrum Speaker Series, for those of you who couldn't join us for last month's event, is a multi-part series throughout the academic year designed to be an open inquiry into the ongoing debate on how to balance between security and liberty in a digital age. The idea for this series grew out of a course that my partner in this project, Phil Taubman, who will be coming out here in just a minute, taught, and he teaches every year. And the title of the course is Need to Know: The Tension Between a Free Press and National Security Decision-Making. You can tell that Phil was a man ahead of his time. I should add that he asked me to mention it's called COM 133 or 233, and it is being offered this year as well in the spring. Now, after last year's disclosure of the NSA's widespread surveillance programs, he and I talked about wanting to share these discussions with a wider audience and a larger campus conversation examining the relationship between security, privacy, and liberty. Each session in the speaker series delves into one particular vantage point with a conversation between a leading figure and a Stanford faculty member. Our first speaker last month was former CIA and NSA Director Mike Hayden, who engaged in conversation with me about the NSA's perspective. If you missed it, you can catch it on Stanford's YouTube webpage or our iTunes U page. Tonight, we move from inside the NSA to inside the newsroom. That played a key role in revealing NSA's secret activities over the past year. Our special guest this evening is Barton Gellman of the Washington Post. He is a senior fellow at the Century Foundation. Bart was the Post's lead reporter on the Snowden materials. He and his team at the Washington Post won a Pulitzer Prize earlier this year for their investigative work. That Pulitzer, I should add, is Barton Gellman's third Pulitzer Prize. He led a 2008 team that won the Pulitzer for national reporting for a series on Vice President Dick Cheney, and he was a member of the 2002 Pulitzer Prize team for reporting on coverage of the 9/11 attacks and their aftermath. My Stanford colleague, Phil Taubman, will lead tonight's discussion with Barton Gellman. Phil is currently a CSAC consulting professor here at Stanford. He spent 30 years as a New York Times reporter and editor, specializing in national security issues, including intelligence. He was, among many roles, the Washington correspondent, the Moscow bureau chief, the editorial page editor, and finally the Washington bureau chief and associate editor of the New York Times. He was part of the senior New York Times leadership team that decided to hold the first story about NSA's warrantless eavesdropping program for a year and then published it in December of 2005. I hasten to add that he and his New York Times reporter wife, Felicity Berenger, both got their start in journalism right here at Stanford as reporters for the Stanford Daily. Yeah, give a shout out to Stanford. Phil's extensive experience in the industry will, I'm sure, lead to some very interesting questions and conversation here tonight. Let me just mention a word about the series moving forward. We have, as part of this series, in store for you Senator Dianne Feinstein, a date yet to be determined, but she has agreed to come and talk about the role of Congress. As you know, Senator Feinstein is the outgoing chairwoman of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. And on April 10th, we will have, as part of the series, Judge Reggie Walton, who was on the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court from 2007 to 2014 and was the presiding judge of that court in his final year. We also hope to schedule a leading speaker from the tech industry at a date to be determined. A couple of housekeeping notes before we begin. Please, if you haven't already, please silence your cell phones. You should be aware that Stanford Video is recording this event, and it will be available online. By being present, you acknowledge that you may be recorded. I'd like to remind everyone that you have cards in front of you with pencils, and I would encourage you to write down your questions so that we can collect them, and there will be time where we will ask questions from the audience that have been collected, and I would encourage you to please write as legibly and concisely as you can. And finally, let me thank the many organizations who have worked together to make this speaker series possible. The Hoover Institution, the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, the Center for International Security and Cooperation, Stanford Law School, Stanford Continuing Studies, and the student group Stanford and Government. And now please join me in welcoming to the stage Phil Taubman and Barton Gellman.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming. I had the pleasure, I can say, of not having to compete against Bart when I was a reporter for the New York Times. It would have been daunting to try to scoop Bart Gellman. So let's start back at the beginning, Bart, with Ed Snowden. When did you first get contacted by him or by an intermediary?
It started in the early part of the year when Laura Poitras, the filmmaker, came to me and said that she had a spooky source who was telling her fairly extraordinary things, and she was trying to figure out whether it was for real. And we'd been friends and colleagues at a center at NYU, and she knew I had done a book on Dick Cheney that had a lot about surveillance in it. I suggested some questions. She would relay back the answers. This went back and forth for a while. And after a while, I got a direct channel with Snowden, who would only speak on the most secure channels he could think of, which were both anonymous and encrypted. And we formed our own relationship. He was trying to figure out whether he could trust me. And the New York Times decision to hold the story back in 2004 on the warrantless surveillance was a big part of his thinking. He worried about that. He worried that if I brought this to the Washington Post, that the Post would decide not to cover it. I was trying to figure out if he was for real. I mean, you know, the old saying, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. He eventually did produce that, but trying to figure out whether he was trustworthy or nuts or playing a game or trying to plant something deliberately false took a lot of work.
So in your career, I know you've dealt with a lot of sensitive stories. At what point in these kind of early phases of your discussions with Snowden and Laura Poitras did you begin to realize the kind of magnitude of what he had?
It was gradual. I was convinced fairly early on that I was dealing with something serious. The people who come to you with kind of amazing stories about extraterrestrials or whatever crazy government plot they want to talk about, I've always gotten some of them. I'm getting more lately. They're often apparent quickly. It's the equivalent of the old, the letters you used to get from jail, back before the internet, and they're kind of written all capital letters with someone's fist, and they had 75 pages of closely spaced handwritten. You knew pretty quickly almost all these tips that they were no good, and this one looked good from the start. And my strategy was to ask questions where I knew most of, but not all of the answer.
But it was clear from the get-go that he was working at the NSA?
No, he never, it was a long time before he said who he was or exactly where he worked. He said he worked in the IC, the intelligence community. He made it fairly clear in the early stages that the stories he wanted to tell would be about signals intelligence, about the NSA. But even that he left ambiguous while he was sort of probing me and I was probing him.
So I know from my own experience it's a kind of interesting minuet when you start dealing with a source with very sensitive information, and you have to try to determine if a person is credible, whether they're potentially setting you up and setting your paper up, whether their motivations at the end of the day may not matter to the reporter, but you still would like to understand the motivations. How did you proceed to try to kind of understand this person whose identity you didn't even know yet?
Well, by asking lots of questions. So I'm glad you mentioned motivation, because people who are not in journalism also often want to judge the story or the source by the purity of the motives of the source. And I don't care at all why someone wants to tell me something. It can be that they're trying to sort of sabotage their boss or advance their career or sort of change someone's mind or, any base human motive. I don't care. I want to know whether it's true. I want to understand the motive so that I can figure out the best way to check the veracity of what I'm hearing. Because one of the main ways you do that is by looking for people with different interests, different motives, different understandings of the world. So you're cross-checking things. So I was asking him just very bluntly, why are you doing this? This is an enormously transgressive act in the world that you say you're living in. Why would you do that? Don't you worry that you'll be doing damage? What's the worst thing someone will say about you? Why will they be wrong? And he gave very persuasive and consistent answers about his motives. And they're the answers you've all heard since then when he speaks publicly. Whatever you think of what he did or whether I should have published these stories, I would claim to you that all the evidence supports the idea that he means what he's saying, that he did what he did because he believed it, that he had come across a dangerous accumulation of state power that we, the people, needed to know about.
At what point, when you began your dialogue, had you already quickly informed the Post, or you were not full-time employee at the time, right?
I was not an employee at all. I had left the Washington Post in 2010. I was focusing on independent projects, writing magazine stories, and I was preparing to write a book about surveillance and privacy in America. And I could have taken the story anywhere. I knew for sure I did not want to be freelance Bart writing this one, and that I did want to work with people who could help, because the Post had a lot of talent, as do other places, where there would be enough mutual trust to deal with this story. This story was sui generis in so many ways. I and the Washington Post have reported before on things that may have been equally sensitive in terms of subject matter, in which the written record might have had a stamp on it that was this highly classified, but we've not held the original document, or in this case, many, many documents, and I felt a strong obligation to protect them and to be sort of careful and thoughtful and mindful about what we were going to write and what we weren't, and that meant that I actually did not give access to anyone at the Washington Post in full. But I went there because I trusted them and because I wanted their resources and their advice.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the decision-making process as you engage the material. And I think it would be useful to talk, at least initially, about the Prism document. So I think just to make sure everybody here is on the same page, why don't you describe what you found in this document that you received from him?
Right, so this was one of the very first revelations from Snowden, or from journalists about the Snowden materials. Prism with an M, kind of splits light. It's a program under which the NSA and FBI, working with the NSA, obtain information from 9 large U.S. internet companies, which is to say more or less the 9 largest internet companies in the world, and under a secret set of orders in the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which, unlike anything before it, instead of saying, I need the information about Taubman, this guy, this suspicious fellow over here, and you go to the secret court and get a judge to say, okay, fine, you've showed me enough reason, you can tap into Taubman. The court was now approving a program under which the NSA promised to follow certain criteria and certain procedures and apply certain protections, but then it would give whatever names it wanted to the companies, and the judge would never even know those names. And it was being done at a much larger scale than had been done before. So tens of thousands a year, as opposed to dozens or hundreds.
And the purpose of this monitoring of communication was what?
Well, so this is for content, right? So you've heard a lot about distinction between metadata and content. This isn't about who's communicating with whom. This is actually the words being said, or the videos, or the audio files, or the photographs being sent back and forth. And the purpose is foreign intelligence gathering. That the NSA has to find itself that there is a reasonable basis to believe that the results of any search, any request, is going to produce valuable foreign intelligence information, which could be about another country, it could be about terrorism, could be about proliferation of nuclear weapons, it could be about foreign hackers. And it's a convenient place to look because a very large fraction of the world's information is stored at rest in these repositories belonging to American companies.
So when you get a document like that, and it's so clearly sensitive and top secret or even beyond, what gives you as a journalist the right to think about publishing it as opposed to giving it back to the NSA?
So this could be a long answer. I'll try not to make it a very long one. Here's how I look at it. There is potentially here a collision between two really important interests, two foundational interests in our Constitution, which are, you could call them self-defense and self-government. So we have a strong interest, it's one of the 6 mentioned in the preamble of the Constitution, in the common defense, securing the common defense. We also have a very strong interest in holding our government accountable to us for its use of power. And they can come into conflict. To the extent that secrecy coincides with security, which it sometimes does, not always, then writing this story could provide a disadvantage, could be harmful to effort to defend us, to the extent that it involves drawing a new boundary between the government and its citizens, drawing a new boundary allowing the government to spy on its citizens, and the citizens never get to know that. That is quite relevant to know when you're trying to decide whether you like what your government's doing. And so I would claim that there is actually no one competent, as a general rule, to resolve that dilemma. The president's not competent, should not be allowed to tell us what we need to know in order to hold him accountable. And I'm not accountable to anyone for my decisions about what is in the interest or not in the interest of the national security of the United States. And so what happens is, as happens in many other cases of complex systems or complex equilibria, is the government tries to keep information secret, and I try to find it out. And then when that spillage happens, first of all, 9 out of 10 times or more, it's an official leak, even if it is classified. It's done at the behest of our political leaders. But when it's not that, and when there are serious questions raised, then we talk. So, first story, Prism. I sent emails to 2 quite senior people I know in government and said, this is the kind of email that I send, only once every several years. I have a story that you are certainly going to want to know about and talk to me about. I'm not going to say what it is here. Tell me how you want to handle it. So I get a phone call. I say, go get a copy of a document with this title, this date, this author, then call me back and tell me how you want to handle it. I'm not going to talk about it on the phone. And then we do make arrangements to talk in a quite substantive way about it. It's a 43-page set of briefing slides with extensive speaker's notes, so there's a lot of information in it. And I said, just to start off, we've already discussed it here at the Washington Post. Only 2 people here have read the document, and we've already decided we're not going to publish anything from pages 17 to 24, something like that. Because those were the detailed examples of how the program was being used, what it had discovered about particular foreign intelligence targets. It was the kind of thing where if you publish it, you're just blowing up the operation. We had no interest in doing that. We had an interest in writing about the public policy question of a program that had secretly expanded in ways that almost no one knew about.
So when you're having that kind of discussion, do your editors participate in that and the publisher of the Washington Post?
That's up to the government. I did this for a long time at the Post. I now came back on a temporary contract, and I did it the way I always did. So in that conversation, there were very few objections they had that I had not anticipated, as I have been around the block on this before. There were 3 words on one page that I was considering publishing that I didn't, that there was an element about that I didn't fully understand, and when they explained it to me, I saw a good reason to withhold it. The main ask they made was that I not publish the names of the companies. And I said, why? They said, if you publish the names of the companies, they may not want to cooperate with us in the future. And I said that if the harm to the national security that you're worried about consists of the public not liking something that you're doing or they're doing, and therefore they don't want to do it anymore, that's why I publish it. I mean, that's the fundamental, that's the essence of an accountability story, is allowing the public to judge whether the policy line is being drawn in the right place.
So while you're working on this, you discover, I guess, at some point that Glenn Greenwald from The Guardian has also been dealing with Snowden. And then that introduces competitive pressure, right? You don't want to get beat on a story. That's true, but it's there's a distant analogy to, let's say, election coverage. You want to make the call first, but you really don't want to make it wrong. You don't want to be the Dewey defeats Truman paper. In this case, the consequences are actually much, much graver. There's no doubt in my mind that there were huge journalistic risks and security risks and legal risks here, and we were going to get it right. And there were stories that others did that I knew and had not, I wasn't ready to go with. And so we got beat sometimes, and we were all very clear that we did not want to make a mistake. I mean, by the way, we had to authenticate this material. I mean, when I saw it, it looked really good. It looked like the real thing. I have seen lots of internal communications, very, very few at the level of secrecy that these have. But, I mean, Snowden and the documents sort of work very clearly within a culture that I knew something about. So, one of my early conversations with Snowden, just as an example, it was by keyboard, I say conversation, and he used the acronym STLW. Okay, so NSA typically, we all now know, I think, takes 2 words, blends them together, puts it in all capital letters, and that's their cover names. So Stellar Wind was the name of the warrantless wiretapping program under the Bush administration. And it's abbreviated inside the NSA as STLW. And I knew that from my last book, but I'd never published it. And I Googled it, I didn't see that it had ever been used anywhere. And here he's using it in a live chat with me. And so I'm thinking, okay, this is a guy who does know something about the inside. So what I want to do is intersperse my conversation with Bart with some questions from all of you. So let's go to a couple of questions from the audience.
Good evening, Mr. Gellman. Thank you for appearing before Stanford's version of Between Two Ferns. So the first question is, have you ever felt intimidated or scared writing about what seems to be a very House of Cards-esque environment, exposing the dirt, so to speak, on the NSA and U.S. government? If I stand a little further back on the subway tracks.
By the way, that's no joke this week. You probably saw some person in New York was thrown in front of a D train the other day. So stand. I did not Bart, mean to joke about it. Yeah, it's that no, do me a favor, Bart. Stand, put your back against the wall, please, when you're at the subway.
I've not felt at, maybe this is naive, I've not felt at physical risk. I was very well aware that I have material that a lot of people want, and I've stated in public in forums like this and in stories themselves that we're withholding things. So I guess my computer has become more interesting than it used to be to others, and so I've taken very serious multi-layered efforts to protect the material, but I was not threatened by the U.S. government, and I did not believe that that I was placing myself at risk of anything untoward. I was very well aware that I and the Washington Post were operating at the sort of boundaries of known space in terms of our legal obligations. There are a lot of unsettled questions about how far we should go, and I thought that since they were unsettled, that we should just do what we thought was the right thing for the story and for balancing these two interests I mentioned before in terms of self-government and self-defense.
Russ?
Okay. This question comes from co-sponsor of this event, Stanford and Government, the student organization, and they wanted to know, to what extent would electing an avowed civil libertarian actually unwind the surveillance state? And a specific example would be a President Wyden versus a President Cheney lead to a different outcome.
It's really fascinating. One of the striking things about all this is how little difference there is. Not only between Presidents Bush and Obama on these subjects, but sort of between administrations. I've covered security issues in the U.S. government from time, off and on, but mostly on, since the first President Bush, and the kind of career experts advising the president don't tend to change views very much. And I think the fundamental thing is, when you study government, you come into the White House thinking you know what your opinion is on things, but every single decision you make is hideously hard, because there's no reason to bring it to the Oval Office if it's less than hideously hard. If you're making decisions based on not nearly enough information and directly conflicting, probably 7 or 8 different conflicting imperatives, there's not going to be a good answer. And no president comes in there and says, I got this. I got this covered. This power, that other power that the other guy used, I don't need this one. I can toss this one out. There's an insatiable hunger for information, and there's a tendency to trust oneself. And so you can sit in that chair and say, well, I sure wouldn't want that other guy to have this much power, but I know I'm going to use it for the right reasons. I'm a pretty good guy. I have the right motives here, and there's nothing to see here, people, nothing to worry about. So I think that there's a risk there would be less difference between President Wyden and President Obama than either of them thinks right now.
Yeah, I would just add as a footnote, as many of you know, President Obama has initiated more leak investigations and prosecutions than all previous presidents combined. So those in the press who thought that he would be someone who would pull back from some of the attitudes towards the press that we saw under the Bush administration turned out not to be correct. All right, one more, Russ, and then...
If Snowden was mainly focused on American civil liberties and privacy, why did he give the Washington Post and Guardian information on U.S. foreign espionage programs such as Angela Merkel's phone or the Huawei backdoors?
Snowden gave me a lot of material that he knew I probably wouldn't publish. I talked to him before I ever got anything from him about what my criteria would be, and the fact that I was going to make that decision, and ultimately the Washington Post would make that decision about what to publish and what not to. He understood that, and he stated then and kept to his word that he was not going to try to tell us what to print and what not to print. He wanted us to try to make a judgment about what was actually in the public interest. Even there are things in there that he clearly feels should not be published, and they are essential to understanding the stories that I am writing about. It's not possible for me to understand. For example, he could have blacked out the 10 pages that I said I wouldn't consider publishing from the Prism slides. But if he had done that, it would introduce a tremendous amount of uncertainty in my mind. What's his game here? What's he blacking out? What does this say? Could this could there be all kinds of stuff in here that amount to the opposite of what the document now appears without those pages? And beyond that, there were things about the way the programs worked that I couldn't understand without the examples. Even if I wasn't going to publish the examples, I had to see them. As far as the foreign stuff, the distinction is not nearly as clear as might appear at first glance between domestic surveillance and foreign surveillance. So let's take the really big picture here. Back in the 70s, Congress passes the first effort to restrict intelligence surveillance at all, with the idea of protecting sort of domestic targets from being surveilled without a judge. And the idea is if you're going to spy on U.S. territory, the implication is that there'll be Americans swept up, U.S. persons as the law has it, and that needs some restrictions. Around about 2000, the intelligence agencies went to Congress and started saying, this thing needs to be changed because it's no longer true that if you intercept something on U.S. soil, it's a domestic communication. In fact, a large fraction of the world's communications, packets switched over the internet, or because of the economics of telephone trunk lines, are crossing over U.S. switches and circuits and territory. And they don't deserve protection. They're foreigners. Now, what they didn't say is a large fraction of American communications are traveling over foreign switches. They're still allowed to presume right now that if they pick something up off the coast of Ireland or between Hong Kong and Singapore, that those are foreign persons that they're spying on. And in fact, that's not true. When they break into the cloud, if they break into the private fiber links between the Google data center in Hong Kong and the one in Ireland, they're not literally directly linked, but there are others that are, then they're picking up not millions or tens of millions, but hundreds of millions of U.S. accounts. And so revealing overseas operations of the NSA is not the same thing as revealing operations that are strictly limited to foreigners.
So let me ask you a question that I have often been asked in the cases I've been involved with. How in the world does a reporter, no matter how experienced or seasoned, able to determine what material is really critical to national security and defense of the nation? I think for a lot of people it's not self-evident why a Barton Gellman or a Bob Woodward or any number of other journalists, even under the freedoms of the First Amendment, should be able to declassify material that government officials feel is critical to our national defense.
Okay, so I would unpack that in several ways. First of all, no one should think that Barton Gellman is the ultimate authority on what's in the interest of our national security. I'm just not. And even if I was super smart guy and had all kinds of smart thoughts about that, I'm not accountable to you for whatever harm I might do. So I don't claim that I or the Washington Post or any council of journalistic elders should have the final say about all decisions, where to draw the line between what's classified and what's not. What I claim is that we should have the final say on the stuff that we find out about, because that's the system that we're working in. We're working in a system that, it's almost like going to the corner store and saying, how dare you set the price of milk? Milk's really important. My kid needs milk. That's the very important social value here in making sure that the children of our country have milk. And yet you take it upon yourself to decide whether it's $1.50 or $10.50 per gallon. That's because you're looking at a large system which reaches an equilibrium and looking at it from the point of view of one person. Because I think the president and the executive branch generally are disqualified from setting the terms under which we examine their conduct, there are always going to be some things that slip out of the walls of classification. As I say, vast majority of those things come out because someone working for the president and doing what he or she believes is in the president's interest, and often at the direction of their political masters, is leaking it. And that drives the intelligence agencies crazy, by the way, also. Of course, sometimes they're doing it when it comes to budget items or something else. In fact, I would argue that the U.S. government could not function without leaks, because if you take only the formal boxes and channels, the whole system simply couldn't operate. But when it comes time to make the decision, I'm not relying just on my own gut sense or my own education or my own experience with this. I will say that I was pretty good at anticipating what they would be worried about. But there wasn't one fact in one of these stories that came from a document that the government did not have at least 48 hours notice that we were preparing to publish. And we heard out what they wanted to tell us. We took very seriously what they wanted to tell us about security risks. If they wanted more time, we almost always said, sure. Sometimes we went back and forth for weeks over certain things where they would say, well, you're putting this at risk if you publish that. I say, well, I'm not willing to take out the whole concept. The whole concept's actually really important about, where we draw the line here. I want to know exactly what part of this is putting someone at risk. For example, if I said it this way, would you make the same assertion? Anybody can take sort of cheap shots, take easy examples. No one inside the classified world would deny that there's huge amount of overclassification, unnecessary classification. I have in my possession, I'm not making this up, a classified U.S. Navy laundry manual. You use this machine and this much detergent, and I swear to God, it's classified secret, which means that a competent authority made a legally binding decision that it would do grave harm to national security if it were ever published. That's obviously nonsense, and there are lots of things that they say, on this larger scale story as well, that are nonsense. They've been unwilling to say even numbers. The number of times they've used certain powers, saying the number of times we use this power would do grave harm. Saying what is the overall number, what is the overall dollar figure for how much our intelligence agencies spend every year. Until 3-4 years ago, they said it would do exceptionally grave harm to the national security if they said that it was $40 trillion per year, whatever it is. So I'll give you one example, right? So after much resistance, and when Congress forced the administration to start disclosing the number of times each year it used Section 215 of the Patriot Act secretly to obtain business records. This is the provision they used to get all the telephone calling records, the metadata. They said there's no reason to worry about this as you consider Congress renewing the program because it's expiring. In 2009, we only used Section 215 26 times. We're obviously being careful and precise about our use of it. It turns out that it takes 12 of those times to get 1 trillion telephone calling records. So now, in ordinary course of everyday life, if somebody tells you 26 and they mean 1 trillion, you're probably going to feel a little misled. Like, I promised to cut back on cigarettes, honey, but it's only a couple of dozen. Okay, you said not to have a party when you weren't home, but I only had a couple dozen people there, or 1 trillion. Why is that okay for the government? And why is it okay to say that national security protects that sort of thing?
So I know early on when you started to deal with Snowden, you went to extraordinary lengths to secure your own communications. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely not. Look, he is removing material he's not supposed to remove from U.S. government systems at the same time he's communicating with 3 different reporters over the internet about the surveillance agency. That was a fairly tough thing for him to pull off, and it shouldn't have been possible, and it certainly was a risky set of behaviors, and so I wasn't going to make it any easier for him to be caught. I wasn't making it easier for him to be stopped from talking to me. So I already knew how to use Tor which is software that makes it difficult to discover who you are and where your computer is on the internet. I already knew how to use GPT encryption, which makes it hard to read the content of the message. I knew how to use Jabber and OTR encryption and the various other tools. I had come to be more and more concerned over the years that as a national security reporter in the post-9/11 environment, it was harder and harder to protect my sources. And I'm not talking only or even primarily about people who are telling me classified facts. I'm talking about people who want to talk to me without the permission of their bosses, without which nothing that you want to read in the newspaper about foreign policy or defense is going to appear in the newspaper or on your computer screen. And so I took all those precautions and others that I still can't discuss to make things, to keep our private conversations private.
Are you fairly confident that your communications about the coverage you've done have not been intercepted by the NSA?
No, I'm not. This is an agency that's very well resourced and really, really good at what it does. And while it can't directly break encryption, for example, by brute force, it doesn't have to. I mean, I'm quite confident that our early communications were undetected because the government would have done something about them, and the government had no reason to be focused on him or on me. But once it was, once you become a direct target and they have a high motivation to surveil you, it's very hard to say, without being quite naive, that you're sure your communications are protected. So Genghis Khan didn't knock down the Great Wall of China to invade. This is a little bit within the category of too good to check, but I read somewhere, and I don't want to give it up, that he bribed the border guards and put ladders up because knocking down the walls are really hard, but. If indeed that's what he did, that's what the NSA would call a side channel attack. So they go after insecure endpoints. And if they can't break my super duper secret code, they'll just steal the password.
So let's talk a little bit about your own safety. I did a series of stories at one point, as my wife will recall, involving a couple of rogue CIA agents. And at a certain point, the colleague who was working on these with me and we both began to realize that our physical safety might be an issue. So I took to checking under my car every day before I started it to make sure a bomb hadn't been placed under the car. So what were you concerned about your own safety as you were on this trail?
I have been, at rare occasions in my career, concerned about my safety. Like the time I wrote about, a fellow who was tried for murder in the District of Columbia and acquitted because of a hung jury. And I got letters from jurors saying that they all thought he was guilty, but they were afraid to vote that way. And he came to the door of the Washington Post and asked to see me. I've been a war correspondent. I've been in, on the wrong end of guns, a couple of times. I've not been concerned in that way on this story. I just don't believe the U.S. government goes around killing people who are journalists. Maybe I'm wrong, and you'll find me in a shallow grave somewhere, but I doubt it.
But you were concerned about legal ramifications, right?
Sure, I was. I was concerned. Look, I was concerned that someone would steal the material from me. And so it's in a place that has never touched the internet and on devices that don't have networking hardware in them and, locked behind grid locks and watched by video cameras and all that kind of stuff. But I was also concerned about, what exactly are the legal issues here? Could someone sort of make a criminal case against publication? Could someone say that in the criminal case against Snowden that I'm an essential witness or that my reporting materials are evidence, try to compel me to produce those? That's a substantially higher risk. I've burned a lot of lawyer time, and we've tried to play close to the edge so that we could do our work as best we could, but we've also been very careful not clearly to cross over the line.
Okay, let's take some more audience questions, please.
So I'm going to take two questions and kind of combine them into one. First one is, what is the future of investigative journalism? How can investigative journalism continue without people sacrificing themselves as whistleblowers? And if you can, please address the dire situation of your colleagues, James Risen.
Okay, so the last first, the scenario I just described to you, an attempt to compel testimony or evidence, that's exactly what's happened to Jim Risen, not for his groundbreaking work on warrantless surveillance, but for a story he told in his book about a failed intelligence operation against Iran. So the man the government says is his source, Jeffrey Sterling, is under indictment. The government wants Risen to testify against him and to produce notes. Risen said he will not do that. This has been fought now for years in U.S. District Court, U.S. Circuit Court, and Risen has now exhausted his final appeal. So it is now in the government's hands, provided that the district judge actually acts on it. If the government can now say, compel Risen to hand it over today, or he's going to jail. It's not a criminal charge, it's civil contempt. The idea is to compel him to comply. Obviously, I think that this is a very serious thing to do when it comes to a reporter and a confidential source. We can't have reporting about national security or almost any other subject if we can't protect the confidentiality of our sources. There is a privilege in this country which obtains when it comes to information you tell your psychiatrist, and it's not without any exception, but it's a blanket privilege. It doesn't depend on what the content is. So it's not to protect disclosure of my great fear of teddy bears that we do that. It's because there's a social good in promoting the mental health of the population and allowing people who have serious problems to get help without fear that they'll be outed. And likewise, if you can't talk to a reporter without fear that the reporter will be one day forced to testify against you, there's a significant social loss in that. It's been a very long time. Well, it's been now 8 or 9 years since the last time a reporter was compelled to produce evidence. I think it's a very scary thing to do. I think it is almost certainly unnecessary in this case, and I think that I think the government has demonstrated it has a lot of evidence against the person they want to charge, and I think it's a big mistake to push in this way. Jim has actually taken a very interesting tack on this. He has said over and over in very emphatic ways that he will never comply with this order, period. And that's an interesting strategy because I believe he means it, but it's also legally consequential. The judge is not supposed to jail you unless he believes that you may comply, that the coercion will work. And if the judge is convinced that you will not comply, he can't keep you in jail. Word to the wise. Yeah.
One hopes.
Sorry, there were two other questions there, and I went on too much longer than that. What's the future of investigative journalism?
Right.
I've always told people if they catch me making a prediction and they can commoditize it, they should sell it short. I am a very bad predictor. It's why I'm glad I'm in an empirical profession. And I don't know how it's going to happen, but I'm optimistic it's going to keep on happening. So the old economic basis for investigative reporting, which is the surplus profit of local monopolies that had sort of a public-minded reason, for example, in the Washington Post or the New York Times or elsewhere, to fund investigative reporting, that's gone. It's not all the way gone, but it's declining. On the other hand, there are no barriers to entry. Anybody with a smartphone can publish a blog, and blogs are not at all necessarily trivial things. There are a huge number of stories being broken by independent citizen journalists. I obviously believe that what I do has some value, and isn't easy for anybody to just sort of wake up one day and start doing from scratch. But there are a lot of really important stories that are broken by people who are simply close readers of the public record or analysts of data or happen to have privileged access to something or happen to notice something and have an insight. I think the world's better in terms of communications and the possibility of getting stories out than it was before. Who's going to pay for long-term, expensive investigative reporting? I have no idea, but I'm pretty sure it's going to happen.
One more, Russ.
Where do you see Edward Snowden in 10 years?
Another prediction. Just remember that. I don't see any immediately obvious scenario that gets him out of Russia. I mean, one could imagine, a special team putting a hood over his head and taking him off somewhere, Gitmo or some other country, depending on who gets him. That's a pretty high-risk operation to undertake in Russia. In fact, Putin gave a press conference after the U.S. withdrew Snowden's passport, and he's in Russia because he lost his passport in transit. He was actually just changing planes. And Putin said, not much less bluntly than this, what are you, idiots? You have no tradecraft at all. Why would you take his passport away when he's here where you can't come get him? Why not let him go to Latin America? Go get him there. What's wrong with you people? And that's actually, I think, a fairly accurate depiction of facts on the ground there. I don't believe that there is any movement at all right now on cutting a deal for Snowden to come back. I don't believe that he's going to come back voluntarily with no understanding of how the proceedings will go forward, because despite what the U.S. government says, he cannot actually come and defend himself. There is, just as a literal matter, no defense. There's no public interest defense. If the Supreme Court found that every single program that he revealed, one after another, was unconstitutional, he would still be convicted. The judge would direct a conviction to the jury as long as it was established that he had access to the classified material and he gave it to someone who wasn't. That's the crime. There is no defense. So he's not going to come back voluntarily, with that being the status quo. I don't think, I think it would be contrary to the interests of Russia as Putin sees them to send him back. So right now I see no reason why he's going to leave.
Mike Rogers, the outgoing head of the House Intelligence Committee, has sort of darkly suggested that Snowden somehow is aligned and working for a foreign power. I don't know whether the implication is China, Russia. The notion is that someone like him with the material he had, it's a little hard to believe. He goes to Hong Kong, hangs out there for a while, and the Chinese don't get the material that he has. And then, of all places to wind up, Russia. So what you know him, Snowden. What do you think of that theory?
It kind of dignifies it to call it a theory. I mean, there's simply, just as a factual matter, zero evidence for the proposition that his intent was to assist a foreign power or that he actually did hand anything to a foreign power. One of his jobs in the U.S. intelligence community at one point was to train U.S. personnel to communicate securely and protect data in a high-threat digital environment, which was defined as, the threat was defined as an analog to China. He knows what the foreign capabilities are, and because he knows that, he didn't bring any of the material with him to Russia. He simply didn't bring it. It doesn't have it. When he told a former senator that even under torture he couldn't disclose it to Russia, it wasn't because he thinks he can withstand torture. It's because he doesn't have it. And I know something and not everything about what he did to render himself incapable of opening it after a short time in Hong Kong, and I believe that to be 100% effective, even against endpoint attacks. If you destroy the cryptographic keys that protect something, then there's simply no way to open it.
So let's talk a little bit about the technological sort of revolution that's transformed the collection of intelligence on one hand, and on the other hand has also transformed the ability of people like Ed Snowden to disseminate it. So it seems rather quaint when one thinks back to the Pentagon Papers and Daniel Ellsberg spending, nights, copying this material and spiriting it home, and then giving it to the New York Times, where a former colleague of mine in Boston had to find an outlet, a Xerox copying shop in the Boston area that would copy the papers for the Times. Today, all of this massive amounts of material can be distributed globally with the click of a mouse. And at the same time, we're collecting vast amounts of information that we couldn't have collected before. So do you worry that we are getting into a situation where on both sides, this kind of old-style gatekeeping role that you played to some extent with Snowden's material is going to disappear, and the next Edward Snowden who comes along, there won't be anyone to delete pages 17 to 24?
It's really hard to make good policy or broad judgments when you're talking about an edge case like this. This is a 100-year storm. This is actually unique in the history of American journalism and national security, that you have this quantity of sensitive secrets extracted. The Chelsea Manning leaks were more voluminous, probably, but none of them was classified above secret, which is where the Navy laundry manual is, and most of them were less so than that. None of them were limdis or no foreign or the other indicators that they're especially sensitive. So this is a highly, highly unusual event, and that's because generally speaking, the people who work in these institutions believe in what they're doing, and even people who don't are more likely to quit or look for a transfer than to say, hey, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to bring the whole thing down and take it all and take those kind of risks. And it takes extraordinarily high motivation to do that. So you have to have an unusual person, but you also have to have unusual circumstances. And so I don't think you have to worry that someone's going to do that with the secrets of our nuclear arsenal. I just don't believe that that's where this sort of trend is going. It is interesting that you mentioned Ellsberg, though. I teach a course sometimes on secrecy and national security, and I was teaching it before the Snowden thing, and I had Daniel Ellsberg to my class, and after explaining to my students what Pentagon Papers were and the Vietnam War and all that stuff, I asked him to show me, explain how a photocopier worked. And so he kind of mimes sort of picking up this big lid and taking this heavy volume and sort of laying it on the glass and pushing a button. And he goes like this. Wait. So that's page 1 of 7,000. And then the whole thing weighs, 100 pounds. And he's got to sort of like carry it around somehow with a cart. I mean, it's a completely different world when you can, with something that's smaller than your smallest fingernail, hold, 5 orders of magnitude more information than that, 10. So the technical possibility of a gigantic leak exists, but you're going to have to show me a lot more evidence. We have not yet seen evidence that anybody wants to do that on a huge scale on a regular basis, or with things that we would all agree should not be told. Look, the NSA was doing things, and not because it was a rogue operation, at the behest of its political masters, that the American people had no idea it was doing, and that many people, having learned of them, object to. And you have Silicon Valley making huge multi-million-dollar changes in its infrastructure specifically to thwart the intelligence agencies of their own government. which is an unlikely thing to happen if what's being revealed is simply something good for foreigners and of no concern to Americans. You have litigation that was tossed out of court over and over again, either for lack of jurisdiction or for lack of standing, because the litigants couldn't prove that they were actually affected by the policy that they believed was happening in secret. They're now going forward, and there will be constitutional findings on the merits about some of these programs. There already have been at the district court level. You have legislation being proposed and debated openly in Congress. You have NGOs that are doing more investigation and lobbying. You have journalists who are digging more into stories about the origins of policies and whether people were telling the truth at important moments in the public debate. All that is, whatever the cost may be, all that is hard to argue is sort of contrary to democratic self-governing principles.
What is, Glenn Greenwald from The Guardian had access to a tremendous amount of material from Ed Snowden, as have you. And The Guardian handled it a little bit differently. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between what they did and what you did, and what you think accounts for that?
I actually kind of want to duck that one. I really don't feel that I should play press critic, sort of yay or nay on other people's handling of a story that I'm working on. I think I probably have less credibility than anyone else anyway on that subject. And I think the stories speak for themselves. People can look over the material and decide, what they trust, what they don't trust, what they like, what they don't like. There was a lot we did in common. Their story on Prism was quite similar to mine, and they withheld exactly the same material I withheld. And there are other stories that I've done that they haven't, they've done that I haven't. Part of that is just because the stories stopped being easy, and the stories stopped being easy to authenticate or to understand, and so it took a lot more time and so you had to choose your target. You had to figure out what from this substantial body of material do I want to focus on? What does this mean? What story do I see in it? It's one thing if you have a 43-page slide deck that's sort of self-contained describing a program, or a court order saying, here, go collect all the telephone records. It's another thing when you have clues buried in 16 or 18 documents that you've read before, and then suddenly the third time you look at something, you say, wait a minute, does it say that? And cross-reference, and then you have to go out and do your own reporting to try to find out what the story means. I mentioned the program that the NSA uses called Muscular in combination with its British counterpart to break into the private fiber links between Google data centers and the private fiber links between Yahoo data centers. And the issue is that you can send an email from here to Sacramento, and it's probably also in Hong Kong, because the data centers around the world synchronize. Data center, as some of you will know, is a gigantic fortress-like building with literally guard dogs and fences and barbed wire and enough electricity to power a mid-sized town and bank after bank after bank of data. And when you connect to your Gmail, they load balance around the world, and they also keep the stuff synchronized for backup purposes. And so your purely domestic email is now sitting over there in Hong Kong, and that story was not at all easy to figure out. If you follow these stories, you might have seen the little kind of yellow cartoon of two clouds and a smiley face and an arrow that said SSL added and removed here. That was one of the iconic images of this story over the past year. I had the cartoon. I could definitely see that if it says Google Cloud exploitation and smiley face SSL, meaning the encryption layer, added and removed here, there's got to be a story in here somewhere. But piecing that together took actually months of reporting. It was partly looking at the documents, and partly the documents had sample packet captures of what is actually being captured that was crossing the wires. And I had to find people who knew the innards of Google systems well enough to tell me that packet right there never travels over the open internet. It only exists inside our cloud, only exists on these private fiber links, and that was the sort of final proof I needed.
So, you know, in the first weeks and months after the Snowden material began to appear, there were these kind of thunderbolts from Snowden that came quite quickly in the Post and the Guardian and Laura Poitras and so on. Are we going to see more of these? I'm not asking you to tell us what your next story is, but or have the Snowden materials been largely exhausted at this point?
I think pretty much all the easy stories have been done, and there are things in the material I have that suggest some important lines of reporting to me, things that I think should be, stories that I think should be developed and told. They're harder, both in the sense that it's harder to understand what's happening, harder to be sure that your understanding is correct, and harder to know where to draw the line on in terms of national security versus the public interest in public debate. I'm not done. I'm writing a book, and I will be trying to break some ground in the book, although it'll be broader than a book about Snowden. So I don't think you should think this is over, but certainly the rapid-fire early pace, which depended on low-hanging fruit, that's done.
Russ, let's do a couple more. We're starting to get near our closing hour here.
Give me my exercise, Phil. Okay. This is another question from Stanford and government. In January 1971, Washington Post reporter Betsy Medker, Betsy Medker became famous for COINTELPRO revelations. Had you been in Medker's position, would you have published as well?
Okay, so we better explain what that was. This is the famous program of the FBI, I think, that was conducted under J. Edgar Hoover. All kinds of domestic spying that went on, which led, in fact, it was one of the contributing factors, along with CIA and NSA abuses in the 1960s and early 70s, that led to the creation of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, led to the passage of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act that put controls on a lot of things that these intelligence agencies can do that the NSA, we discovered from Snowden, had moved to ignore in some ways. So she found this material. There was a break-in at an FBI office in Pennsylvania. They stole the material. The Washington Post published it. So that's the background for this question. So I guess the question is, if you had that, would you publish it?
I think it's a pretty easy call. I would say yes. I mean, everything is so granular. It so depends on the nuances of the facts of the situation that, you know, I can't pretend I know exactly what all the considerations were. But what you had here was, and it's interestingly different and similar to what we've got in the current story. It's different because it was just self-evidently lawless and villainous and groundless behavior. I mean, it was a classic Hoover operation that was sort of choosing political enemies and digging up dirt on them. I mean, there's almost no plausible case I could imagine being made that it was important to the security of the country to do any of those things. In fact, it's an object lesson in why you worry about the accumulation of so much latent power in the hands of government, even if you trust yourself sitting in the White House or as Jernsa, the director of the NSA. We have in our recent past examples of people like Hoover and Nixon who very clearly, obviously, blew across all lines and abused those powers. And so you're collecting information that could be used for ill. So right now, what the programs I'm writing about would sort of beggar the imagination of Orwell, and yet they are not, certainly not for the most part. I mean, and there's very little evidence and only sort of very edge cases in which this information is being abused in an Orwellian way, or even a Hooverian way, to sort of suppress dissent or to pick on people who are sort of disfavored. So you have the government taking all this power and not yet, and doing it, I think, largely speaking, in good faith. People who believe they're protecting us, people who know that there are threats out there, and or know that the president wants to know something and want to give it to him. It's just that when you do it all in secret, then all the countervailing interests sort of get tossed out the window. You're maximizing your interest in information. So yes, I would have published that story.
Okay.
It's the shorter answer.
I think this question kind of hits the fact that you've seen so much of the NSA revelations, and someone wrote, I have a hesitancy in searching the internet sites for information to educate myself about ISIS, Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Syria, Somalia, etc., etc. I fear these keywords will raise red flags and subject me to further scrutiny. Please comment.
So, okay, so we smile, we laugh, we chuckle. I don't know how to answer that question in a way that sort of seems sensible and is also honest. But I will be honest, as best I can. The NSA is not interested in finding anybody who ever looked for ISIS on the internet or sort of making certain search terms or certain incorrect thoughts into forbidden territory. But when you know that there is mass surveillance, when there is mass collection, according to rules that you don't understand and with oversight that is not capable of overseeing what they're doing, then there is a natural chilling effect in terms of communication. There is no doubt that people are saying less and being more careful about what they search for because of the knowledge that it may fall into the hands of the government. And that is a big problem. That's one of the fundamental problems of surveillance, even if you don't abuse it. It's also the case that when you're doing analytics on big data and your view is let's not take any chances, that you could run into something by coincidence that hurts you. And so, just put it this way: we've now learned that there are, that the lists of suspicious people that the U.S. government keeps, ranging from the no-fly list to the no-entry list to the single out for secondary inspection at the border list, and you could go on. This is now well into the 7 figures. Okay, so there's not 7 million terrorists in the world, or 1 million, or 500,000, and so you have to wonder how all these people got on there. And you do know that coincidences. You just happen to have had your cell location in the same place at the wrong time with too many people, and you triggered some word, or you once lived at an address, and there's too much smoke. They're going to assume there may be some fire, and you could be disadvantaged. You could not get a security clearance one day when you apply for a job, one of 4.1 million jobs now in this country that require clearance, and so on. So I understand why people feel chilled, and I think it's not because the government wants to forbid you to search for information about anything, but it's because it could be a secondary effect of what they are doing.
So let me wrap up with a couple of final questions. What should happen to Edward Snowden?
I'm not the guy to ask. I mean, he's my source. I've depended on him. I'm in regular contact with him. I received information from him, and it's not my place to judge him. And you shouldn't take my word as any more interesting than anyone else's on that.
And tell us a little bit more. I know you spoke earlier about the kind of person he is.
I find he is fascinating to me because he's an unusual figure. I mean, I alluded earlier to the idea that he did something that almost no one ever does, right? So you come into a large and cohesive and well-resourced and complicated organization. You see things that bother you. Almost everybody, like the largest number of people in that situation just figure, well, everyone else is doing it, and they seem like good people, and we have an important mission, so I guess it must be okay. The second group of people maybe ask some questions or mount some objections or says, are we sure this is okay? And then eventually reaches the same conclusion. The third group of people says, I think I'd like a transfer to another office, or I'm going to quit and go play violin in the subway, or whatever. You don't have people who say, I, Edward Snowden, I'm going to do something about this. It's just so it's highly unusual. It speaks to a certain sort of zealousness about principle as he sees it. And the important thing for me to say is that he is zealous in defense of principles that have resonated with a lot of people. It's not as though he did this thing and came out and said, ta-da, and everybody threw tomatoes and said, well, that's a terrible idea. Why would you tell us that? I mean, a lot of people thought it was really important to know this, and there are a lot of changes happening, or at least under debate, in terms of commerce and technology and interpretation of current law and passage of future law and so on, that are all, and of course in the diplomatic world, that are all energized by those disclosures. He described himself to me once as an indoor cat. He is, you all know some of these people. They're not far from here on campus or probably far from this stage in this room, who kind of lives in a virtual world. There is not a whole lot of difference for Ed Snowden whether he's living in Moscow or Hawaii, which is a remarkable thing to say, but it's true because his intellectual life and his social life and his community are, largely speaking, on the screen, on the net. He is a sort of a net native. He's an ascetic personality. He doesn't have or want stuff very much. He doesn't care very much what he eats. He is sort of Zen-like in his confidence that he's done what he set out to do and that he did the right thing, and that whatever the sacrifice is that he ends up making, he's glad he did it. He has turned down millions of dollars in offers for book and film rights. He's not in this for the money. And he's kind of is what he looks like he is. And what he says is what he means. Whether you judge it however you want, but there's not a whole lot of second and third level hidden meanings. You're seeing more than the tip of the iceberg. You're seeing pretty much the whole thing.
So is there anything that you regret about any of the coverage that you've done, or anything involved in your dealings with Snowden and the preparation of the stories?
Look, I am open to criticism like anybody else. I am sure that there are some things that in the fullness of time I wish I'd done differently. Right now, I'm pretty comfortable with where we drew the lines and how we did them. I was frustrated by things lots of times. I spent so much time on trying to secure communications and materials and so much time with lawyers that it's sort of a giant tax on my ability to do my job. And so the pace at which I've been able to work has been a lot slower than I wish it was, but I wouldn't unhave the conversations with the lawyers, and I wouldn't leave the material sitting out where somebody else can grab it, so I don't really see I had a lot of choice. The things that I've held back from stories, I've not subsequently become convinced that I should have published. And where I thought I should add detail later, I've done so. Coming back once again, because it's by now a little bit familiar example, to the Google and Yahoo cloud exploitation stories. The government came out very angrily with sort of a three-pronged attack on that story, and sounded very much as though it was denying, that it was stating flatly that the thing was false. That's something that has not happened very much as these stories have unfolded, and so people were taking it seriously, and so I decided to publish considerably more detail 2 days later to demonstrate that it in fact was happening, and this is how we knew it, and to demonstrate by sort of doing a little bit of analysis that they were not actually denying the facts. They were denying things that the stories didn't say.
Well, I think it's worth noting as we close, Amy alluded to the Pulitzer Prize at the beginning, one of the three that Bart has won. This one is the exceptional Pulitzer that's awarded every year for public service reporting. It's the highest honor that the Pulitzer board gives out, and I think we can see tonight why Bart won it. So thank you very much. Appreciate your coming.